Hello, welcome to this week's installment of Stat Plus Conversations, a weekly video chat series exclusively for Stat Plus subscribers. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nicholas St. Clair, a general assignment reporter and associate editorial director of events here at Stat. And in just a few moments, I'll be joined by Drew Joseph, who is also a general assignment reporter at Stat. But first, a few quick housekeeping items, though I'm sure we're all Zoom experts by now. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a few icons. Use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves or to send a message directly to the Stat team. Please note that we will not be taking questions directly from the chat. But if you do have a question, and I hope you guys have a bunch of questions, please use the Q&A feature and we'll try to answer it live. You'll also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and upvote the questions you'd most like to have answered. We will be taking your questions throughout our conversation, so just start asking them now. There's no need to hold off until the end of the chat. Now, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker for today. Please welcome my colleague, Drew Joseph, General Assignment Reporter at STAT. And he's also a finalist. He was a finalist for this year's Pulitzer Prize in breaking news reporting. Drew, it's so great to have you today. You've really been our dogged Delta variant reporter. Just to kind of start off, so what exactly is the Delta variant and why, as you've noted in your coverage, why is it such a big deal?
Yeah, so Delta is just the latest variant to come up, of the coronavirus. I think it actually first appeared last fall, maybe, and it was first seen in India. And initially, I don't think it got on anyone's radar, but then it really, it had helped drive the sort of explosive outbreaks we saw in India, and has since then kind of become dominant in a lot of other countries. It drove a big outbreak in the UK and is now the variant that's driving the big outbreaks we're seeing in much of the United States, and is now responsible for, I think, more than 4 in 5 sequenced cases in the United States. So it is by far the dominant variant here as well. Mm-hmm. And the biggest concern, there are a couple of them, but the biggest concern mostly is that it's just so transmissible, maybe like twice as transmissible as the original virus. From late 2019. And what a transmissible virus can do, as we're seeing, it just can sort of tear through populations really quickly before policymakers have a chance to sort of respond, and it, can lead to these big surges that can overwhelm hospitals. So that's kind of what we're seeing right now.
So do we know why it's more contagious?
Yeah, so there are a couple different, when we talk about a more transmissible variant, there are a couple different mechanisms for that. It could be, this is just a result of the virus evolving and mutating, which is just what it does. And it has more chances to do that with higher levels of transmission. So for example, the virus can get better at sort of latching onto cells and infecting cells and starting an infection. So maybe that means you have to be, you're more likely to get an infection if you're exposed to the virus. What really seems to be likely in this case, at least as part of the story, is that it's really good at replicating in cells and is really fast at replicating in cells. And so that means that if you contract it, your level of virus shoots up really quickly and you start emitting, or it's called shedding, lots of virus. So you're probably just shedding more virus to just around. And so it's more likely to infect other people. And with such high viral loads in your nose and your throat, you're likely to be infectious for a longer period of time. And so that just means on average, you're more likely to infect more people, which is what drives outbreaks.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about, why this seems to be a different, landscape or different scenario than earlier in the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different landscape for, good and there's positive and negative. The negative is that we have this really transmissible virus, the most transmissible one we've seen by far. Delta also had sort of pretty bad timing from our perspective. In the United States, at least, it really took off, and we helped it take off because it came at the time as we were kind of easing back on all our restrictions, which was merited and was understandable from a lot of reasons. Like, we were all ready for, to get back to life. And so, but, rolling back all those mitigation efforts, the masking, like that has helped, getting back to just like sort of day-to-day activity, that has helped fuel Delta. But at the same time, it's much different now here in August 2021, than in even August 2020. We have vaccines, and that is such a huge plus for us. It is making, as bad as these outbreaks are, they would be much worse without the presence of vaccines. So there's the landscape's changed in good ways and bad ways.
And now, talk to me a little bit about some of these breakthrough cases that we are seeing amongst vaccinated folk, and why that is a concern.
Yeah, so breakthrough infections at their most basic definition are just infections that occur after someone is vaccinated. And they're getting a lot of attention right now, and probably deservedly so. But it's important to remember that, like, even in the early days of the vaccine campaign, we were told to expect and not worry too much about breakthrough infections, because no vaccine is 100% perfect. Respiratory viruses in particular are really hard to, it's harder to just like design a vaccine for respiratory virus. So we knew there were going to be infections. But what's important is that the vaccines are just like incredibly effective, with like very few rare exceptions, at preventing hospitalization and death. And that is what the biggest priority. The vaccines have also been shown to prevent, just like straight up prevent, a lot of infections as well. So that's been like sort of an added bonus, and why we've had so much help in cutting transmission. Delta changes that to an extent. It doesn't rewrite the story at all, but it changes that to an extent. Basically, with Delta, vaccines are still incredibly protective against hospitalizations and death, the main priority. And they are still really helpful for transmission, and they are preventing a lot of infections. But the fact of the matter is, Delta might cause breakthrough infections, or Delta appears to cause breakthrough infections at higher rates than earlier forms of the virus. And it might also be that more of those breakthrough infections are symptomatic, so people are noticing them more as well. It's a little hard to compare, apples to apples at different parts of the pandemic, because the virus changes and our behavior changes. But it does appear that Delta is causing breakthrough infections at a higher rate, and maybe more symptomatic infections as well.
We're already getting a number of questions in the chat, so I'd like to, of course, remind our viewers to just put them in there, and I'll pose them to Drew. But before we get to some of those, I have a couple more of my own. In your reporting, you talked a little bit about, some of the biological reasons as to why people who are vaccinated may still, feel sick when they're if during a breakthrough infection. Tell me a little bit more about that, as well as a little bit about, why being vaccinated right now is just so important.
Yeah, I mean, vaccination is important no matter what, like no matter the time, because it protects you from the worst outcomes. It likely prevents you from infection. And even if you do get infected, you're less likely, it's not impossible, but you're less likely to spread it to others. So, but to your question about like why, and this kind of gets to the question of like why vaccines are hard to design against respiratory viruses. Basically, especially shots that go into your muscle, into your arm. Your immune system is really good at fighting the virus once it tries to sort of infiltrate your lungs. And that is when you get severe disease. And so that's why it's so good at preventing hospitalizations and deaths. It's harder for your immune fighters that the vaccine provokes to prevent an infection entirely, especially when it's up in your nose. It's just like harder for the immune cells to get there and the antibodies to get there. And particularly with something like Delta that is so good at infecting the cells in your nose. So basically what's happening is it's having a harder time preventing the infection at all, or fighting it off like super quickly before you even develop symptoms. And that's why some people with breakthrough infections are reporting symptoms of a sort of upper airway infection. So it could be headache. It could be the sort of sensory things like losing smell. Could be fever. And those are all symptoms of an upper respiratory infection. But the good news is that your immune system is still fighting it off pretty quickly, and it's preventing the virus from getting into your lungs, which is when you can really run into issues.
So tell us a little bit, from your perspective as a reporter, what it's like, reporting on breakthrough cases in particular, without being, alarmist in this case, the kind of risk communication challenge here?
Yeah, I think the pandemic changes in matters of degree, which is hard to communicate sometimes, and I struggle with that. I think health officials are struggling with that. The news last week that some vaccinated people have really high virus in their upper airways, their nose and their throats, like on par with unvaccinated people, I think scared a lot of people, frankly. But like you need to look at it as like that is like it's hard to say like what percentage of people that is, but that seems to be like a pretty small percentage of people because first of all, vaccines are still preventing many infections. Second of all, a lot of people who have breakthrough infections are likely asymptomatic, and it's not clear what their viral levels are or what their contribution to transmission is. And so they were focusing on this sort of new emerging group of people, which is important to study, and it's important to communicate the risk about, as you learn. But it's hard, you need to think of it as like, this isn't everyone who's vaccinated who gets a breakthrough infection. This isn't everyone who's vaccinated, period. So there are still big differences between vaccinated people and unvaccinated people.
Mhm. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the unvaccinated folk right now. Is Delta more along the lines of a wake-up call because it is just so contagious? The transmissions are up. We had so much, I guess you could say, optimism in the spring, and now it's really spiking back. What are we seeing amongst vaccinated folk in terms of the spread, as well as are we starting to see some of those unvaccinated folk turn into vaccinated folk?
Yeah, so the thing that like public health experts worry about most is a more transmissible virus because it can just sort of burn through people really quickly. And that's what we saw happen in Nevada, Arkansas, Missouri, where we're seeing now in Louisiana and Florida. And so it can just drive cases up super quickly. It does potentially appear, and this is something that's really hard to study, but it does potentially appear that Delta is also more likely to cause severe disease. And again, it's kind of hard to parse, and in part because like the population of who's getting sick has changed, but doctors are saying like they're seeing a lot of young adults who are unvaccinated coming into the hospital. And that's in part because so many more older people are protected because the vaccine uptake among seniors is really high. And then these people are really sick and they're crashing faster than they've seen throughout the pandemic. Again, it's hard, like those are sort of anecdotes and it's hard to know for sure, but there is some evidence at least that suggests Delta is also causing more severe disease on average. And so Delta could be sort of bad in more than one way beyond just how transmissible it is. But I guess a silver lining or one positive thing, if you want to look at it, is that vaccine rates have started to increase again after falling off sort of throughout the spring and into the summer. And they're increasing highest in areas that are kind of under siege by the virus right now. So those states I mentioned earlier. So I think, whether it was like, making people realize how serious this could be, or it's sort of a wake up call, whatever you want to call it, or maybe they just knew someone who got sick. That's inspiring more people to go get their shots, which is great. And, we're also seeing other policy changes as well, whether it's incentives or we're starting to see more vaccine mandates come out, whether it's governmental agencies or private companies. And so like it's starting to change. Of course, there are still a lot of unvaccinated people out there as well. And in particular communities, you need to look sort of at the local level.
Right. So you had touched a bit upon, the elderly getting vaccinated, especially now at very high rates. We have a question here from Cindy the DiBiase, who asks, with waning immunity of current vaccines after 6 months, isn't it a problem that the first people vaccinated, mostly elderly, are now going to be seeing their vaccines wane just at the time that Delta is coming? And I think this question also speaks a little bit to, the conversation about boosters as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. Just to sort of contextualize things, I think the data on waning immunity, some studies out of Israel, some data out of Israel has suggested as much. but again, it sort of depends on what you're talking about. Like it's it appeared that there was waning immunity towards symptomatic infection overall, but not toward hospitalization and death. So you kind of have to think about like, what's the goal here? What are we trying to prevent? Particularly at a time when we don't have like, there's just huge disparities in access to vaccines around the world. So yes, so there's, I guess it's not to dismiss the question at all, because there is some evidence of that for sure, but there's, I guess, a bit of conflicting evidence, because there's other evidence that shows vaccines are sort of, months out, are still holding up their strength. But yeah, I mean, other countries have started to roll out extra doses to either people who are immunocompromised, who maybe didn't mount a good response, or to older people because of this question about waning immunity. And, as we've talked about, older people are the most vulnerable to the severe outcomes from COVID. And just in general, like with vaccines overall, older people tend to have less of a robust response, just because their immune systems like just aren't as strong in general. So, I don't have a good answer for you. There's a debate about this, about boosters, about even if we should call them boosters, and it's really more about just figuring out the right dosages of these new products in general, who these extra shots should be for, when they should be delivered, and if that's even ethical at a time right now when so many parts of the world don't have shots. So I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't have a good answer for you. Like, obviously people are pointing to this as evidence that we need more shots, particularly because, it's only August 3rd right now, but like the fall is not that far away. And like Delta's kind of in like the summer wave has kind of confused us, but like it's likely that we could have another, if things come down, have another upswing come the fall. But it's, I don't want to predict that 100%.
Not a problem at all here. Thank you so much for that response. We have a question here from Dr. Heidi Coomer, and we've been talking a lot about data, and Dr. Coomer asked, is there any data on individuals who had COVID, did not get vaccinated, now getting Delta, and how they fare? Have you come across anything like that in your reporting?
Yeah, so natural infection is generally protective to an extent and for a certain amount of time. And there's not going to be one answer that, like, if you had in COVID, like, you are going to be protected for X amount of time. There's not going to be one answer. There's going to be a huge variability there. Delta is likely causing reinfections at a higher rate than earlier forms of the virus. That's kind of the same thing. It's like akin to vaccine, but with some differences. I think, again, it depends exactly how there's going to be variability, and it depends how far out you are from infection. Like, similar to vaccine, you are probably more protected. You're still quite protected against severe outcomes. But again, with Delta, maybe you are more likely to feel sick for a few days than if you had been reinfected by another type of the virus. But what I will say is that there's a lot of evidence that, like, sure, natural infection is protective to an extent, but vaccines offer more robust protection and appear to offer more durable protection. And so that's why there's recommendations that even people who've been infected should be vaccinated. And also, if you do, you probably have a really strong immune response. Like the double is good, is a good thing.
And on this subject of, vaccines and vaccine hesitancy and such, I saw something not too long ago that was breaking down, who the unvaccinated are. And a decent amount of people have said along the lines, I don't want to get vaccinated until it's, fully approved, or I want to wait a year to see kind of, what happens. Brenda Askey asked, what is the rationale behind the FDA dragging feet on full approval, on pediatric approval? And why aren't they discussing booster recommendations and booster approvals? So a lot of questions targeted by the FDA, but to kind of take that first part, why, in your view or from your reporting, has the FDA kind of been dragging their feet on full approval right now?
Yeah, I would, my colleague Nick Florco had a great story, I believe, on Friday, sort of looking at that exact dynamic and sort of how the FDA is really trying to ramp up its effort to approve, I believe it was Pfizer's vaccine. So I would encourage you to look at that. He's our FDA reporter. He knows it really well.
Right.
I think it's just a process, and I'm not a regulatory expert, so I'm kind of going to refer you to that story. But it's just like a process, and you have to get a certain amount of data, a certain amount of time to do these things. And I think, admittedly, some experts think that a full approval would help with vaccine hesitancy. Others are not so sure, and like there is a concern about, even if approval happens, if it's seen as sort of slapdash, like maybe that doesn't change people's minds. So I think there are some like nuances around this. And I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you. I would say, in terms of your other question, why aren't people discussing shots for kids or booster shots? I think that they are discussing that. Like there's a CDC advisory committee that at their last meeting, which is all public, they were discussing extra shots for people who are immunocompromised, for example. And, the FDA, I think I'm not sure exactly if they have all the data yet, or if they're still waiting on more data for shots for kids under 12. And that it's not just like 0 to 12. I think it will go down, by age groups. So these things are in process. It just is taking some time. And I understand the frustration, but like, I think these things are being discussed as well. And like, particularly because like with kids, it's like, schools start in some states like pretty soon, I think. And so there's like, there's definitely pressure to get these things authorized for kids under 12 at this point.
When we had spoken earlier, you were telling me a bit about a case in, I believe it was Provincetown, around July 4th, where there was a bit of an outbreak of the Delta variant. And we had been talking a bit about that. I'd love if you could talk to our audience a bit about that particular case. And also in doing so, Christine Farku-Hawson has a question about, is there any reliable data on Delta's ability to transmit in outdoor settings?
Okay, I'll take that one first. So outdoor settings are pretty safe, like really safe. That's not to say transmission will never occur, but I think, pre-Delta, like the outdoor transmission that was confirmed was like people in close setting, like, being in really close proximity to each other for extended periods of time. Like, and people worried about, for example, like sporting events where people were yelling and screaming in close like proximity for a long period of time. Delta, because it's just more transmissible, period, is likely more likely. It's basically, there's a higher likelihood of it transmitting outdoors, but that's not to say that outdoors all of a sudden become really dangerous again. Like there's lots of airflow, there's a lot of other things. So it does increase the risk to an extent, but I would say the absolute risk is still pretty low. I don't know like how actionable that is, but like I think the overall risk is still low if it's higher than what it was 4 months ago. Okay, so the Provincetown outbreak, that is what in part led the CDC to update their masking advice last week for vaccinated people, saying even vaccinated people should wear masks in public indoor settings in areas where there's lots of spread. And basically what CDC officials and Massachusetts Department of Health officials sort of learned from this outbreak was that, over the 4th of July, Provincetown is a town on Cape Cod. There were like a lot of, there was a good amount of transmission, including among people who were vaccinated. And so that just made them, and that's through contact tracing and looking at their viral levels. That's how they realized that some vaccinated people, not everyone, some vaccinated people have these high viral levels, appear to have these high viral levels in their noses and throats. And there was some kind of debate about how applicable it's called P-Town, how applicable the P-Town outbreak was to everyone, because like Provincetown, for those who don't know it, is like kind of this like gay mecca where just like a ton of people come in for the summer and like are in nightclubs and bars and house parties. So it was just like, if any environment was ripe for transmission, it was there. But I mean, I don't know how different that is from a nightclub or a bar in any other location. I guess maybe people really did travel from all over the country there, but the point was that they saw some transmission from vaccinated people to others, which led them to revise their masking recommendations.
Great. Thank you so much, Drew. Lawrence Brickmont asks, are we closer to herd immunity with 35 million cases plus vaccinations plus unidentified cases slash asymptomatic. So are we close to herd immunity right about now?
So yes, between natural infection and vaccinations, like it's not like a light switch where it's on or off. Like basically you ramp up population immunity. So you start with zero population immunity, and that's when everyone is vulnerable. And then you build up over time and more people become protected and more people become protected through infection or vaccination. And that will gradually over time put a break on us, like slow down, like act as a drag on transmission. Herd immunity isn't super, I know it's a term that's thrown around a lot. It's not super, it's not like the way herd immunity works at like a technical definition is not super like helpful in this situation, just because like we have so many people who aren't even, not just like not vaccinated, but aren't even eligible for vaccines. Like we still have kids, like, you know, and they make up a good amount of percentage of population. And plus, like, there's a thought that because these vaccines don't provide like, don't prevent all infections, like it's not, it just like the application of herd immunity is a little bit flawed here. I think the question is like, the better way to think about it is, and also, sorry, one more thing about herd immunity is that like it's typically confined to a geographic area, but people are moving in and around all the time. So it's like you could technically reach an area of herd immunity in a certain community, but then more people could come in there and then the virus could spread again. So it's like it's kind of the confines of herd immunity don't really work with a respiratory pathogen and just the way people move these days. But so your broader point is, you're right. We do have a lot of people protected. And even if there's some transmission among people who are vaccinated or have previous infection, there's like transmission would be much, much worse without those people being protected at this point, for sure. And so we are in a better situation again with vaccines and through natural infection than we would be otherwise. So, I mean, and that's the other thing with like a more transmissible virus like Delta. It actually, because it's so transmissible, it increases the whatever herd immunity threshold is, like it just increases that. More people have to be protected to act as a brake on Delta. So that's why even in places like Massachusetts, where I am, like even though so many people are protected, like cases are still going up, not as fast as they are in other places, but that's just evidence of like how transmissible Delta is.
We have a lot of great questions coming here. And if you have any more questions, any of our viewers, please feel free to put them in the Q&A here, and I'll be sure to pose them to Drew. Drew, we have a question here from Keith Richer. Keith asks, are vaccine manufacturers able to re-engineer the vaccine to optimize protection against the Delta variant, either for unvaccinated individuals or for boosters?
So yes, and I believe, I can't remember if it's like, I don't want to say all vaccine makers are, but definitely some have started testing Delta specific shots should they be necessary. But at the same time, they've also been testing just another shot of their existing vaccine. And it seems like in early studies, those shots are kind of boosting your antibody levels, boosting your immune fighters to levels that, even though the shot hasn't been adapted to Delta, like the overall immune response they're sort of triggering is plenty powerful to handle Delta. So it's like, if we decide we need more shots, it could be just fine to get another shot of the existing vaccine, which is obviously easier from like a manufacturing and a regulatory perspective, because like those things are already sort of, the FDA has already authorized them to a certain extent. Like, the factories are set up to make those. So yes, they are looking at variant specific boosters, but it's not totally clear that if boosters are needed, they'll have to use the variant specific boosters.
Okay, thank you for that. Poria Deggan asks, kind of a follow-up to the P-Town question. You mentioned there was evidence in P-Town that vaccinated people were infecting others with Delta. Was this evidence just the high amount of virus in swabs, or was there more direct evidence of infections originating from vaccinated people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there was some pushback on the CDC, using viral levels as like the determination for this new masking guidance. And I think what's the scientists I've spoken to say is that these viral, like the way they measure viral levels through these tests, like it's a pretty good proxy for infectiousness, but not perfect. And so there is like an argument to be made that like, well, you don't know for sure that they were all this virus that was detected in some, in a vaccinated person's nose was quote unquote like live virus. Like it could have just been a particle. So you don't know if they were actually infectious. And also, even if a vaccinated person had this like really high level of virus in their nose or throat, it was probably for a much shorter period of time than someone was unvaccinated. So they would be infectious for a shorter amount of time. I think though that like contact tracing sort of has also suggested it's possible for vaccinated people to spread the virus to an extent. Again, it seems like it's a much smaller percentage than overall transmission, which is broadly driven by unvaccinated people. But like, I think there is also contact tracing evidence in addition to these sort of experiments, these tests showing viral levels in people's noses and throats.
Mm-hmm. So David Watermule asks if you know what is the R naught of the Delta variant, if you're familiar.
Yeah.
And then some reports are saying that it's as contagious as chickenpox. Could you elaborate a little on why that is it interesting, or why that should be mentioned?
Yeah. So I think chickenpox. I think there's a vaccine for it now, so it's like not what it was, but like when I was a kid, I got chickenpox or whatever. But like, and they would just talk about how like, if a kid walked into a classroom with chickenpox or like had a sleepover with chickenpox, like everyone was going to get it. So I think to a certain generation, like that reference is very specific. To your broader question, the R naught of Delta. So I would double check this. I'm sorry, I don't have it off the top of my head, but like, I think the estimated R naught of the original virus was like 2 to 3. And R naught is essentially like on average, how many people one person goes on to infect. So an R naught of 2 to 3 is saying like, if you are infected, if you have COVID, you are on average likely to infect 2 to 3 other people. And so that's obviously what drives outbreaks, because that's increasing the spread. This one, I think the estimate is like 5 to 6. So that's like sort of where the idea of this is twice as transmissible comes from. Of course, like, R naught is not like, that's sort of like a scientific term, but like, we don't live in like sort of scientific isolation. Like there are so many other factors that influence like the inherent R, like if there's an inherent R naught, there's so many other factors out there that sort of influence that. It's our behavior, it's the season, it's what we're doing, it's where we're interacting with people. It's also how many people out there are protected. Like we were saying, like there's more population immunity at this point than there was at earlier parts of the outbreak, and that's something we have in our advantage. So like there are like these inherent biological things of like how much a virus will spread on average, but there's a lot of like outside circumstances that can influence that as well. Masks are another thing that can lower R naught. So yeah.
We have a question here from Peter Padbury. Peter is asking, it looks like it will take several years to vaccinate the planet. New variants of concern are likely to emerge in low and middle income countries, as well as high income countries. What does that mean for public health measures in developed countries over the next few years? Do you know of any group looking at the medium-term future for the pandemic? And people are wondering, like, will there be a lambda, a gamma, zeta, all of these things lurking around the corner?
So I think there is a lambda variant already. I believe that's driving some transmission in South America. But I don't think it's been characterized super well yet in terms of like how it would compete with Delta, for example. So yes, that's an argument why the world should care, why rich countries should care about global vaccination campaigns, is that, pandemic by definition is affecting the world, and that like the whole world isn't going to be safe until, we kind of drive the whole pandemic down. So it's possible that worse variants emerge, or variants with like sort of really bad combos emerge. It's hard to, you can't really predict what the virus is going to do. there's like kind of schools of thought in virology that viruses evolve to become more transmissible, but potentially less severe, but like not all virologists buy into that. So it's hard to predict. Like one thing, for example, was there's this other variant called Beta, which first emerged in South Africa, and that seems to have even more immune evasion sort of ability than Delta. Not to say it renders vaccines ineffective, but it just, similar, like maybe causes breakthroughs at higher rates. So in a way, like one silver lining of Delta is that it's so transmissible that it has like completely outcompeted Beta in a lot of places. So like we don't have to worry about the immune evasion of Beta. So like these things all kind of interact with each other. But to your point, yes, like it's like, yeah, viruses evolve, and that's what this is doing. And the more transmission that's out there, the more chances it has to mutate.
We have a question here from Philip Maurer. Drew, you're getting so many questions. People are very interested in this topic, and you're doing a great job fielding them all. Philip asks, is the PCR, it's a very sciencey question, is the PCR Delta positive results in fully vaccinated people just RNA segments neutralized by antibody/cellular immunity, or is it actually fully contagious virus considering the large load recorded?
This is what I think I understand what you're saying. This is what I was saying earlier when I was talking about some of the critiques of using viral level as a proxy for infectiousness, because these tests measure the amount of virus, but to this questioner's point, it's not clear if it's like infectious virus. It might just be these virus particles that have been like sort of neutralized by your body's immune response, which was primed by vaccines. So like I was saying, it's used as a proxy. I think it's often considered a pretty good proxy, but there are some caveats, which you just mentioned. So I think, from the CDC's perspective, I guess they wanted to make, presuming this proxy was real, like, and these viral loads were real, that's what led them to make their masking updates to the masking recommendations. But yeah, I think there's a question of just like, if vaccinated people have these viral levels in their nose and throats, and again, it's some vaccinated people who have breakthrough infections, there's a question of like, if that's truly as infectious as someone who is unvaccinated and have those viral levels in their noses and throats. So I don't think it's totally like, there's not a firm conclusion yet, but that's a great question. And like something I think a lot of people are looking into.
We have another question here from Keith Richer, who asks kind of an opinion question, if you don't mind. Okay. It looks like the tide is turning towards requiring vaccine mandates, as you mentioned, for governmental agencies and private businesses. Given how Delta has proliferated, what is your opinion on this trend, and how far this will go? And they have a part B. Which mandates do you think will be most effective to encourage vaccines in those that are hesitant?
Yeah, I mean, like I'm a reporter, like I don't want to be prescriptive, and I don't want to say like, companies should or shouldn't do this. But like from an evidence perspective, I think vaccine mandates work. In France, like you saw a big uptick in vaccine cover, like people getting their shots once they were like, you can't do a lot if you're unvaccinated. We're going to put these restrictions in, and you see that like, so it's just like if you make life hard for people who are unvaccinated, like more people will get vaccinated. It's just kind of what it is. And I think you also have to meet people where they are and address their concerns and improve access, and all those things also have to go into it. You can't just impose these mandates. So yeah, like, and it seems like a lot of governmental agencies or, companies were maybe hesitant to, or like slow to kind of institute these, but now that like a bunch have, it's like maybe the tide is turning or whatever, and like we're going to see more and more. So, and I don't know how to like best, if you are supportive of vaccine mandates, I don't know how to like best design them to increase uptake the most. Like people have joked about like, in a place like Alabama, if you had to get like show your vaccine card to like get into an Alabama football game, like that's the best way to increase uptake. But like, I don't know if that's really possible. So, so there's different approaches with this, but it's been interesting to watch how sort of now private company after private company is doing this. So, yeah.
Kate Dobson is asking, is anyone from your, reporting, from your understanding, is anyone evaluating whether those with vaccination could benefit from exposure to the virus, Delta or other variant, in terms of developing increased immune system memory slash response? Kate goes on to say, it used to be pre-chickenpox vaccine that people would expose kids to the illness and get it over with, since they developed long-lasting immunity. But I'm not asking about unvaxxed. I'm asking about vaxxed doing deliberate exposure.
So I don't think any public health professional would, in this case at least, advise exposing yourself to this virus. In part, I mean, like, I guess, in part because like something freak happens, something like rare occasion happens, or some like rare thing happens, like, I don't know, like, a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of vaccinated people are going to have bad outcomes if they get infected again. But it's also just like now that we've seen that like it's possible for a small percentage of vaccinated people who get infected to pass it to others. Like it's not just a matter of yourself anymore. You might, then you could be potentially at risk of spreading it to someone else. I mean, like, so I don't think anyone's going to advise that. But like there is a point that there's a principle behind what you're saying, is that, COVID's not going to go away forever. Like, we're not going to eradicate it. But basically what's going to happen is through vaccine and through repeated exposure, our body's going to get better trained and like just recognize it really well. And so overall, there's going to be variation, but overall with each subsequent exposure, our body's going to be better equipped to fight it off. And so like this is probably just going to turn into something that causes a lot of like asymptomatic infections, or like generally causes, it becomes a virus that causes the common cold, which there are a lot of viruses that do that. Again, there's going to be variation. There's going to be some freak exceptions, but that's kind of the long game with this virus. And it seems like we've started on that road if we're at the early part of that road. So there's like a principle, like a sort of a foundation underneath that question, even if I don't think but that's just going to happen in our lives. We're just going to get exposed to this. Like, I don't think people would recommend exposing yourself on purpose.
And speaking about like the long game, as you've written in your coverage, long COVID is, a thing. We still don't fully understand, the long-term effects of COVID. And even mild cases, as you've reported, mild is it's kind of a mild word for some of these mild cases.
Yeah, I mean, so those are two different things. I think people are realizing now with breakthrough infections, like, sure, it might be limiting people to mild disease, but like also like a mild disease can make you feel pretty bad for a couple of days, but at least you're not getting sicker than that. Actually, like Lindsey Graham, the senator, yesterday said like he had tested positive for COVID. He's vaccinated, but he made the point, he's like, I like have, it feels like I have a sinus infection and I'm grateful it's not, it would be worse if I hadn't been vaccinated. But yes, to your point about long COVID, that can come from really mild infections. I mean, and this is a separate issue, but the scientists are still trying to figure out, like, with breakthrough infections, if long COVID is possible. It seems like it might be, but there's still like a lot of questions about that. And maybe it's less debilitating. Maybe it lasts for a shorter amount of time, but that's another sort of line of questioning as well, or another line of scientific inquiry that's happening right now.
And then my last question, as I had mentioned in our intro, you, along with Helen Branswell and the late Sharon Begley, were Pulitzer Prize finalists for your coverage of the pandemic during the early days. How does this moment right now, covering the Delta variant, how does it either compare from your perspective as a reporter with, your Pulitzer Prize finalist work in the beginning of the pandemic? And do you feel, I guess, more optimistic right now than you had felt during that kind of coverage?
Yeah, I mean, from a reporting perspective, like I just, it was great that we got recognized for that early work, but like, I just didn't know nearly as much about epidemiology or vaccinology or evolutionary virology as I do now. And not to say I'm an expert now, but at least like through reporting on it for the past year and a half, I kind of have a stronger foundation than in those early days. And there's also just a lot more known. So there's a lot, more accessible answers than there were in the early days. From like a personal perspective, I mean, yeah, it's really like you look around and you see people getting sick and dying, and it's really sad. And especially now, at least, in places that have vaccines, these are almost entirely not all, almost entirely preventable deaths. And so there is a sort of an extra level of sadness to that. And again, like that's in places that have access to vaccines. Which I guess, the fact that a lot of places don't right now is another thing that's just like really, really depressing. But overall, like the fact that we have these vaccines, the fact that they arrived when they did, and the fact that they are so effective, like, I'm grateful for that. And it makes me optimistic that a lot of things have worked out, even if a lot of stuff hasn't.
True. Thank you so much for your time. With that, I think it's about time that we wrap things up. Thank you again for joining me today, and to our audience for just giving Drew so many questions here. Again, we will be hosting Stat Plus conversations on Tuesdays at around 1 p.m. Eastern Time each week. Be sure to sign up for our next chat, which will be on August 10th, when I will be sitting down with Fouad Namouni, who's the President of Research and Development at Blueprint Medicines. We will be having a conversation on Blueprint Medicines, which is the maker of targeted cancer drugs and the future of oncology. I'll be very interested in, kind of what we get to discuss next week. But again, I want to say thank you to you all, and thank you again to Drew for just fielding so many questions. Thanks, everyone. Take care and be safe.
Thank you.